Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, does enlightenment come suddenly, or does it come gradually and progressively, over time as one learns and practices?
I'm not sure. I'm not enlightened, so I don't know. However, I can see arguments for both. On the one hand, learning the Buddha's teachings is marked by several small moments of realization. However, at the same time, many monks and nuns claim to have had singular moments of great realization where it all came to them at once.
It must differ from person to person. Some people learn visually, others learn through reading about something, others prefer experimentation. I imagine the same applies to enlightenment. Some people realize it all at once, and others realize slowly over time.
Indeed. I also think that enlightenment cannot possibly be one single thing. To think of it in such terms makes no sense. It isn't a pie, and you either finish the whole pie piece by piece or in one sitting. It is your actions, the mindset informing those actions, the perceptions of the world informing that mindset, the nature of the consciousness coloring those perceptions, and so much more.
I think you're right. Perhaps it is not a matter of gradual or sudden enlightenment, but rather living the Buddha way or not.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing a topic submitted to us by our listener John. Thanks to John for asking, what is Korean Zen or Seon Buddhism? How does it syncretize with indigenous Korean religion? How is it different from Chinese Chan or Japanese Zen? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. What is Korean Zen or Seon Buddhism?
Seon Buddhism is the Korean version of Chinese Chan or Japanese Zen, and it is the most common type of Buddhism in Korea today. It, like all other Chan traditions, relies most heavily on jhana meditation as the important practice for monastics. As we've discussed before, Buddhism was introduced to the Korean peninsula around 372 AD. This was during the Three Kingdoms period of Korean history. This period lasted from 57 BC to 935 AD, and it is so called because modern-day North Korea, South Korea, and parts of Manchuria in China were occupied by three kingdoms called Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla. Buddhism was introduced to Korea by three monks who hailed from India and Western China. This started a period of Buddhist scholarship and development in Korea that would last until 1392, when the Joseon state repressed it in favor of Neo-Confucianism. During the roughly 1,000 years between its introduction and its repression, Buddhism developed in Korea as the courts of the various kingdoms sponsored monks to go study Buddhism in China in successive waves. This practice began in the late Three Kingdoms period, especially in the 6th century. In 526, there was a famous monk named Gyomik from Baekje who sailed to India by sea to learn Sanskrit and study the Vinaya texts, or the monastic rules. Later, the monk Paya from Goguryeo studied under the Tiantai master Zhi and brought Tiantai back with him. This sort of thing continued, and many schools of Buddhism, which we are familiar with today, and some we aren't, began to develop in Korea. These include the Samlon, or the Madhyamaka school, which centered around middle way philosophy, the Gyeyol, or the Vinaya school, which studied and practiced the rules for monastics, the Yolban, or the Nirvana school, based on the Mahayana version of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, Wonyoung, or the Yuanrong school, which studied the philosophy of the Avatamsaka Sutra and was considered the premier school, especially among educated aristocracy and elites, and also Hwayom, which is the Korean version of Hwayan, or Kagon Buddhism, which also focused on the Avatamsaka Sutra, but in a different way from the Wonyoung. Later in history, Chan was transmitted into Unified Shilla, a state in modern-day South Korea that lasted from 668 to 935. It's said to have been brought over from China by Byom-nang, who studied with the fourth patriarch of Chan Buddhism in China who was called Dai Daoshin. Soon after this, practice of Seon Buddhism flourished among practitioners who lived and meditated in mountain monasteries. During this time, Seon was organized into what came to be called the 9 mountain schools. These were essentially 9 lineages of teacher-student relationships which practiced and studied according to the tradition set by their particular teacher-student lineage. Interestingly, however, 8 of these 9 lineages were connected to a very important Tang Dynasty Chinese Chan monk known as Mazu Daoyi, who lived from 709 to 788. He was important, obviously, for having 8 separate lineages of Chan Buddhism directly connected to him in Korea, but also for inventing the shock methods that we've discussed for Zen Buddhism before. He believed that it was efficacious to shock his students out of their everyday consciousness and cause them to have sudden enlightenment that way. And so he pioneered a method where he would suddenly shout at his students while they were in dialogue, or he would also whack students with a flat stick on the shoulder while they were meditating, or he would also suddenly call out their name as they were leaving a dialogue with him. 8 out of 9 of these mountain schools practiced these methods and others, and the 9th school was from a different Chan thinker known as Cao Dong's lineage. Cao Dong was a very important school and a very important lineage in Chinese Chan Buddhism during the 6th century. This lineage was at the time older and more conservative than the other schools, so they rarely employed such methods as these other 8, and they mainly stuck to koan practices, meditation, and study of the sutras. In 826, all of these schools unified, and they eventually came to call themselves the Jogye order. At this time, the Jogye order sought to distinguish itself from the other schools I mentioned before. Specifically, the Huaiyom, the Wonyang, the Samlon, the Yelbon, and all these other older 5 schools were mainly scholastic traditions. They were textual traditions that wrote treatises based on the sutras, the commentaries on the sutras, and also the works of their own predecessors. However, Seon and the Jogye order collectively were much more founded in the practice of jhana meditation. It did not completely do away with the scholastic tradition, but it emphasized practice in a way that the other older schools didn't, and this caused some tension with these older schools. Later during the Koryǒ Dynasty, which lasted from 918 to 1392, there was a monk named Jinul who lived from 1158 to 1210, and he sought to unify, revive, and repair Korean Buddhism into one single thing that functioned for everybody. He was a member of one of these 9 mountain schools, and he would go on to make the Jogye order that we mentioned before into the most popular and widely practiced form of Buddhism in Korea. And this is still true to this day. Jogye order Seon Buddhism is still the most popular form in Korea in the modern era. The way he accomplished this was by standardizing, reframing, and expounding upon many extant Seon teachings and practices. These included complicated topics such as enlightenment and nirvana thought, also essence-function thought, interpenetration thought, and the relationship between Seon and indigenous shamanistic practices, all of which we will discuss in the next questions. After the Jogye order became the primary form of Buddhism practiced in Korea, the Joseon dynasty quashed it and oppressed it, as mentioned before, and it didn't come back into the picture really until 1897. Of course, many people still practiced Buddhism, and it still existed during that time, but it sort of falls out of the historical spotlight due to the preeminence of Neo-Confucianist traditions.
How does Korean Zen syncretize with other indigenous Korean religions?
Just like in China and in Japan, there are many practices, icons, and artworks associated with Seon Buddhism that originate with shamanism. This is due to several reasons. First and foremost, this is related to an issue we mention a lot on this show, which is that religious identity didn't work the way that it works now back in the ancient past. Saying, I am this religion, not that one, is a modern idea that operates on the assumption that religions rely on voluntary participation, that they're defined against each other, and that they're mutually exclusive as a result. None of these things were true in the past. There's not even a word for religion in Korea at the time. So the idea that the world and the forces within it was populated by spirits was widespread in Korea, and this is the same as it was in China and Japan. Additionally, death rituals involving making offerings to the recently dead, to loved ones who have just passed away so that they had a better afterlife was also very popular. Buddhist death rituals are historically very similar to this, and that's no coincidence. It's a real chicken and egg question. We don't really know if Buddhist death rituals look like indigenous ones because they incorporated indigenous ones into their own tradition, or if they look similar because death rituals looked like that even before Buddhism got there. The real answer is probably both. Buddhism itself came up in a richly populated pantheon, and so it's no wonder that Buddhists were well used to adapting to existing pantheons and ritual traditions. As we know, Buddhism frequently operated by subsuming the pantheon of an existing tradition within its own. A monk would go out into the mountains and practice meditation or chant a sutra, and then come back and say, "I have preached to the spirits of the forest, and they are all now bodhisattvas." Or a monk would create a mandala with local gods enshrined in it right next to Buddhas and bodhisattvas, creating sort of a syncretized cosmology and a syncretized pantheon. In this, Korean Buddhism was no different from any other kind of Buddhism. As we've mentioned before, Korean shamanism revolved around a female shaman who would provide ritual services for the community in the form of exorcisms of malignant spirits, offerings to the spirits of natural forces to seek a good harvest or safety from catastrophe, and ancestor worship and funerary rituals. People did not see any huge disagreement between this way of seeing the world and Buddhism, and so there was no sort of erasure or doctrinal conflict from either side. However, shamanism did strongly influence Buddhist practice among Seon Buddhists in Korea for a very long time. This is part of the reason Jinul saw the need to reform and unify Buddhism. Many members of the 9 mountain schools are said to have fallen in with the shamans who were practicing things like dream reading, fortune-telling, and other stuff that the higher-ups in the ecumenical structure of Buddhism deemed unbecoming of a Buddhist monk, and are often prohibited by some Vinaya texts. This sort of thing especially created tensions between the 9 mountain schools and the Samlon or Vinaya school, where they took the Buddha's rules for monks and nuns very, very seriously. However, in understanding that tension, we should keep in mind who was upset about what. The older Samlon school, once very wealthy and powerful, was losing relevance and popularity and favor among the people, and so they looked to these newer schools, who were more popular among the elites, and they griped over these perceived moral failings, seemingly in an attempt to stay relevant and stay superior. Aside from that, Seon and indigenous shamanism coexisted very nicely together. There is nothing particular or special about how Seon syncretized and coexisted compared to other schools in China and Japan, but it did so nonetheless.
How is Seon Buddhism different from Chinese Chan or Japanese Zen?
As mentioned before, Jinul was a major thinker and reformer in the Seon tradition, and his writings concerned many topics, but where he made his largest contributions were in the topics of enlightenment thought, essence-function thought, and interpenetration thought. In Chan, Seon, and Zen, it was and still is an open debate as to the nature of how enlightenment strikes the individual. Some argue that it is incremental, gradual, and progressive. It is marked by several experiences that all eventually culminate in the completion of one's enlightenment. This is supported by a few stories in Buddhism. For example, Shakyamuni Buddha himself was a bodhisattva in a past life, demonstrating that he received bodhisattvahood prior to reaching Buddhahood, and then when he was born in our realm, the earth, Jambudvipa, he then later reached Buddhahood. These are regarded as being 2 distinct levels of enlightenment, supporting the claim that enlightenment is gradual and incremental and progressive over time. However, the other side of the debate argues that it is sudden and all at once, citing that the Buddha was not omniscient, was not supernaturally powerful, and was not able to teach his enlightenment until he had his enlightenment experience under the Bodhi tree while he was alive on this earth. Both sides of this debate cite far more complicated doctrinal and philosophical points for their positions, but this is the simplest and most obvious way to present and communicate their sides. Jinul, seeking to unify these ways of thinking, argued that enlightenment was sudden, but practice was gradual leading up to it. That is, if you practice some every single day, then you'll undoubtedly have a sudden enlightenment experience. In that regard, sudden and gradual enlightenment are non-dual in a manner of speaking because practice and enlightenment themselves are non-dual. Next, he is said to have written and taught on essence-function philosophy. Essence-function is a concept originating in China under the name Yong. The argument is that T is the essence, or the absolute reality, the original cause, or sometimes even suchness, and Yong is function, which is the relative or phenomenal reality and is the tangible, sensible manifestation of T. It is important to remember that T and Yong do not represent two separate things, but are rather two aspects of the same process, and also completely represent the whole of reality together. Jinwoo is said to have developed the concept of the original cause and how it relates to practice. There was much debate on this topic because Buddhists were arguing that the T, the original cause, was emptiness or suchness, Buddha nature, etc., but they couldn't resolve how that, as an original cause, led to unwholesome realities, such as dukkha, delusion, and more. He is said to have written on this topic, but I don't really understand his perspective that well, and there isn't much scholarship in English on Jinwoo, so I invite you to go ahead and read and interpret it yourself if you can. He also taught on the concept of interpenetration, which we've discussed before. This is the argument that because all things arise in the world due to causes and conditions, only other things that arise due to causes and conditions can actually serve as causes and conditions themselves. There's no anchor point in reality in which exists some permanent and substantial existence. As a result, everything in reality arises interdependently on everything else. Because of this lack of an anchor point, then that means that the whole of reality, at least in part, serves as the cause and the condition for everything you experience all the time. Thus, if you come to truly understand this relationship of interdependence in everything you see, then you can see how the whole of reality interpenetrates. You can see the nature of X in that of Y, because no matter how distant and disparate and seemingly separate X and Y might be, they are interdependent on each other and so are causally connected, and so are of the same nature, which is emptiness or suchness, and so they can be known completely through each other. These doctrines are not exclusive to Seon, to Korean Buddhism, or even to all of the East Asian jhana schools of Chan, Zen, or Seon. However, Jinwoo represents a unique contribution to each of these topics, and I encourage you to go out and read as much as you can about him. He's a very interesting figure.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Korean Zen Buddhism. Join us next week where we'll be discussing a topic submitted to us from our listener, Tanner. Shout out to Tanner for asking. How does rebirth really work in Buddhism? What actually undergoes rebirth? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Many thanks to our patron, Tanner. If you would like to join him, please take a look at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. We thank you for your support.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.